has its voice. I'm Tamara Rockwood. I believe poems weren't made to sit still. They are meant to be spoken, felt, lived, and eaten. Here on Bainbridge Island, where gray skies and salt air are part of the rhythm, my husband Ben and I run Bainbridge Island Press. We publish poets who write from somewhere real, but publishing isn't enough. These words need breath behind them. They need to be heard. And today, we are pairing poetry with bread, the kind that warms your hands when you pull it from the oven, the kind that steams when you slice it, the kind that fills the kitchen with a fragrance that says, "You are home." Bread has always belonged to poets. It's sustenance and sacrament in the same loaf. It is the excuse to linger at the table and the reason to gather there in the first place. For me, bread isn't all about being a baker. Cupcakes are not in my wheelhouse, and they never will be. But bread is different. It took me years to master. There are multiple rising times. You find that out. But I make it for my family often. And there is something about kneading the dough, watching it rise, and it feels like you're tending to something ancient. Also, I am a poet, and so that's how I make bread, is through metaphor. But here in the Pacific Northwest, on this cold, cold winter day, there's nothing quite like the comfort of fresh baked bread. And poets have been writing about this humble food for centuries, finding language for something that nourishes without asking permission. So, pour something warm, get a cup of tea, settle in, and let's listen together. Welcome to Poetics. So before we dive into our 3 poems about bread for today, I want to take a moment to talk about why poets write about food in the first place. Because bread and food, more generally, show up in poetry again and again and across cultures and across centuries. So, Pablo Neruda, great Chilean poet, once wrote, and he wrote about food all the time. Anytime I talk about food, he's going to show up. He said, on our earth, before writing was invented, before the printing press was invented, poetry flourished. That is why we know that poetry is like bread. It should be shared by all, by scholars and by peasants, by all our vast, incredible, extraordinary family of humanity. Poetry is like bread. Both are ancient, both are fundamental, both nourish us in ways that we don't always have words for. So why do poets reach for food when they are trying to say something true about the human condition? First of all, food is universal. Everyone eats. Every culture has its bread, its rice, its staple that holds the family together. When a poet writes about bread, they're writing about something that crosses every border, every class, every language. They're tapping into a shared human experience. Second, food is sensory, and poetry lives in the body. It's about texture, sound, the way words feel in your mouth, and food engages all of our senses at once. The golden color of a crust, the yeasty warm fragrance, the satisfying crack when you break it open. There's a soft, unyielding texture. Food gives poets a doorway into the full sensory experience of being alive. Thirdly, food carries memory. Proust had his Madeleine, if anyone has read Proust. We have our grandmother's recipe, our mother's kitchen, the meals that marked our holidays, the meals that marked our grief and our celebrations. When poets write about food, they are often really writing about memory and about the people who fed us and about love expressed through the labor of cooking. There also is, food is transformation. Bread doesn't grow on trees. It begins as grain in the earth. It becomes flour. It mixes with water and fire. It rises and transforms into something entirely new. And poets love transformation. It's what poems do. They take ordinary words. They make them into something that feeds the soul. And finally, the reason why poets use food is because food is communion. We break bread together. We gather around tables. We share. And in that sharing, we enact one of the oldest human rituals, the acknowledgement that we need each other and that we belong to each other. And when poets write about bread, they're writing about all of this. They are writing about life, about death. They're writing about what sustains us. And that's exactly where we're going to go with our 3 poems for today. So the first poem that I'm going to read to you today is called Bread. It is by Richard Levine. Levine was a Brooklyn-based poet. He was a retired teacher. He was a Vietnam veteran. This poem appeared in his 2012 collection, and it was titled A Tide of 100 Mountains. It was featured in the former U.S. Poet Laureate Ted Kooser's column called American Life and Poetry. This is a poem about a grandfather who was a baker. It is about work. It is about family. It is about the way bread becomes so much more than bread when it is made with loving hands. So here it is, Bread by Richard Levine. Each night, in a space he'd make between walking and purpose, my grandfather donned his one suit in our still dark house and drove through Brooklyn's deserted streets, following trolley tracks to the bakery. There, he'd change into white linen work clothes and cap, and in the absence of women, his hands were both loving well into dawn and throughout the day, kneading, rolling out, shaping each astonishing moment of yeasty predictability in that windowless world lit by slightly swaying naked bulbs where the shadows staggered woozy with the aromatic warmth of the work. Then the suit and drive again at our table, graced by a loaf that steamed when we sliced it, softened the butter, and leavened the very air we'd breathe. He'd count us blessed. So 3 interesting things about this poem. First, it moves through 2 transformations. So the grandfather transforms from a man in a suit to a baker in white linen, and then the bread transforms from dough to a loaf that graces the table. And both transformations happen in darkness and in spaces most of us never see. This poem is a tribute not just to the grandfather, but to a kind of labor that is largely invisible. The work happens at night. It is in a windowless world. It is in the absence of women, meaning it is away from the domestic sphere, and yet this labor is what sustains the domestic sphere. The bread comes home, and the family is fed. Now, Levine wrote this poem decades after his grandfather's death, but notice how present tense the sensory details are. We can smell the bakery. We can see the swaying bulbs. And memory, when it is this vivid, collapses time. The grandfather is still there. He is still kneading. He is still coming home with warm bread. And so three strengths of this poem, I think first is restraint. Levine never tells us he loved his grandfather. He never says, "This meant so much to me." He simply shows us his grandfather's routine, the bread, the table. And those two devastating final words is "count us blessed." And the emotion comes from what's understated. And another strength of this poem is its circularity. The poem begins in darkness. It begins in the space between waking and purpose. And it ends at the family table. It follows the loaf's journey and the grandfather's journey, and they are the same journey. And night after night. And this circular structure mirrors the ritual nature of grandfather's work. But I think that the greatest strength of this poem is its generosity, because this poem about giving without asking for recognition, this is the grandfather's blessing at the end for himself. It isn't for himself, it's for his family. And he counts them blessed. And this poem honors a kind of quiet, steadfast love that expresses itself through work rather than words. So this also, it seems like you read it and it's a very easy poem to read. But I wanted to discuss the language and craft elements of this, because every good poem uses craft, every good poem uses craft elements, and I think that seeing that in good poetry is important, not only as a reader, but as a poet yourself. And with your writing, what else can I do in my work? So the three things that I found in this, the first one is just listen to that gorgeous oxymoron at the beginning. Each astonishing moment of yeasty predictability. The grandfather's work is routine. He knows exactly what the dough will do, and yet it's also miraculous every single time. That tension between predictability and astonishment, I think, is the heart of this poem, and it's the heart of baking. There are times when I think I was just complaining about this the other day. It's the middle of January right now. I was trying to bake bread, and the darn thing just cannot rise. I had it, when I lived in California, the air is different and the weather is different. And it was really nice and warm kind of like all the time. And even on cold days, it just wasn't that cold. And now in Washington State, the air is completely different and the weather's different and the moisture is different. And so air is going to affect a rising dough completely differently. And so there are things you have to do to help the yeast get to where it needs to go. But in January, it's cold, it's dry, or at least inside we have a fire going often, and so that dries out the air. Anyways, it's so hard to get the dough to rise. I could probably spend another half hour complaining about that. But what I'm saying is that there is an astonishment when you get the dough to rise. And it's a small miracle, but I think it is. Anyways, the second one, so the first one is just the key to the lock of just the astonishment and the predictability. But then there's the personification of objects, of visuals in the poem, and this cannot be overlooked. Shadows staggered, woozy with the aromatic warmth. The bakery is so full of fragrance and heat that even the shadows are drunk on it. This is a sensory writing at its finest. It is giving life to the inanimate to show us just how intoxicating this space is. And then lastly, the word leavened is in the final stanza, and that word is doing double duty because yeast leavens the bread, it makes it rise. But here, the bread leavened the very air we'd breathe. and the grandfather's labor lifts up everything around it. The mundane becomes sacred, and that is what great word choice can do. It can carry multiple meanings at once. So that was, honestly, that was a very comforting poem, and I think it was a delight to find, and it was so nice to read. Okay, the second poem is called All Bread. This is All Bread by Margaret Atwood. This is Margaret Atwood of The Handmaid's Tale fame. I actually studied her work for my master's, and I studied the emotional narrative of female characters in short stories through liminal spaces. I don't need to go into that. Liminal spaces are just spaces in between the private sphere and the public sphere. It is doorways, stairwells, hallways, sidewalks, the bus. It's just you in liminal spaces, you aren't meant to stay there. And I determined that in those liminal spaces is where we change. We don't change in the kitchen. That's a domestic sphere. We don't change in the boardroom. That's the private sphere. But when we get into the car and we drive from the house to the boardroom, we change. We put on a different hat. When you go into the bathroom, you wash your face with water, you compose yourself, you can cry in the bathroom, you put on different clothes in order to emerge as, not a different person, but a different hat. You put on makeup. It's just, the bathroom is an incredibly liminal space. Closets, liminal space. So anyways, I was studying her work because she wrote, this was like 10 years ago. So it wasn't 10 years ago. It was, not math. Anyways, it was a while ago. And the story was this woman who went on a cruise, and she was older, and she was just really angry at men for various reasons, various Margaret Atwood reasons. And then she finds the man that began it all when she was a kid. And spoiler, she takes him out to, they were on a cruise up in Canada somewhere. And so they went up to some volcanic area. And I don't remember any of the details. But anyway, she beats him in the head with a rock, and then she gets back on the cruise, and that's her closure. So anyways, that's Margaret Atwood. So we're going to read a poem that is titled All Bread by Margaret Atwood, and we're going to see where this takes us. Because before she was known for her novels, she actually was a poet. She still is a poet. She's published more than 15 collections of poetry. This poem is from her 1978 collection. It is called Two-Headed Poems. Unlike Levine's tender family portrait, Margaret Atwood's All Bread is earthy, philosophical, and unsettling. She wants us to think about where the bread really comes from. Not the bakery, not Grandpa, but from the earth and everything that dies to make the earth fertile. Oh, Atwood. Anyways, here it is. So, All Bread by Margaret Atwood. All bread is made of wood, cow dung, packed brown moss, the bodies of dead animals, the teeth and backbones, what is left after the ravens. This dirt flows through the stems into the grain, into the arm, 9 strokes of the axe, skin from a tree, good water, which is the first gift, 4 hours, live burial under a moist cloth, a silver dish, a row of white famine bellies, swollen and taut in the oven, lungfuls of warm breath stopped in the heat from an old sun. Good bread has the salt taste of your hands after 9 strokes of the axe, the salt taste of your mouth, it smells of its own small death, of the deaths before and after. Lift these ashes into your mouth, your blood. To know what you devour is to consecrate it almost. All bread must be broken so it can be shared. Together we eat this earth. Oh, it's so sweet. 3 interesting things about this poem. First, Atwood refuses to let us romanticize bread, which is kind of weird because bread is kind of romantic, but not here. While most of us think of flour, water, yeast, clean ingredients in a warm kitchen, she traces bread back to its origins. Cow dung, dead animals, bones picked clean by ravens. She's reminding us that everything we eat is made from death. The earth grows our grain, is the graveyard. No. The second really interesting thing about this poem is that it reads like a hidden recipe. There are numbers scattered throughout. There are 9 strokes of the axe. There are 4 hours. There are 9 strokes again. These feel like instructions. Chopping wood for the fire, rising time for the dough. Atwood elevates this recipe from a humble form of writing to the level of poetry. And then this poem is deeply spiritual without being religious. The final lines echo the Christian Eucharist. Bread broken and shared. Ashes lifted into the mouth and blood. But Atwood makes it secular and even larger. We are not just sharing bread. We are eating the earth itself, and every meal is communion with the planet that sustains us. In the 3 strengths of this poem that I see, so I'm going to do 3 strengths and then 3 language and craft elements. So this is my formula. So 3 strengths of this poem, I think it, to begin, and this is Atwood, it's unflinching honesty. Atwood does not comfort us. She makes us look at the circle of life and death that we participate in every time we eat. And this, as a poet, takes courage to write a poem that makes readers uncomfortable. Sometimes that is a breach that we don't want to go to as a writer, and she is showing us how to do that. This challenges the purity that we associate with something as innocent as bread. And it is that challenge that is the fire of the poem. The second strength of this poem is its movement from the particular to the universal. And that's something that is always very, very important to see, and also to start with your poetry. There was Billy Collins, and that's how he starts. He says, I always start with something small, and it always gets bigger. And that is a really great way of also including the I into your poem. So she is moving from the particular to the universal. We start in the dirt. We move through the kitchen. We end with, together we eat this earth. The poem expands outwards from one loaf to all bread, to the entire planet of all humanity eating together. That's a powerful structural choice. All bread. And so the final strength is the final word, which is almost. To know what you devour is to consecrate it almost. The almost is doing so much work because it acknowledges that we can never fully understand or honor what we consume. That keeps the poem humble, and it resists an easy resolution. And also there's a liminality about that word almost, because that's tipping it. You are not going to be comfortable at the end of this poem. It's almost all bread, but almost. Okay, so 3 language and craft elements that she used. So first, the diction is deliberately plain and very Anglo-Saxon. It is monosyllabic. There are words like dirt, wood, teeth, salt, mouth. This is laborer language. It matches the earthiness of the subject. There is nothing elevated. There's no Latin. The language itself is humble like bread. But then notice the startling metaphor, rising loaves as white famine bellies swollen and taut. In one image, Atwood is connecting the fullness of bread to the emptiness of hunger. So the loaves look like these distended bellies of starving people. Plenty and want exist in the same image, and that is the kind of metaphor that stops you cold. So that language that she's using, that craft element of looking at something a different way, it's like, also uncomfortable. And so finally, this poem uses free verse with irregular line lengths, which mirrors this organic process that it describes. The lines are uneven. It is like real rising dough, like the unpredictable growth of grain. Atwood lets the form follow the content, and nothing is too polished, nothing is too regular. Life and death are messy, and so is this poem's structure. Aw, thank you, Margaret Atwood. I don't think we're on a first-name basis. I don't think I should be on a first-name basis. Anyways, we're going to go into the next one. It's so exciting. Okay, the third poem is Ode to Bread by Pablo Neruda. And as I said, if we talk about food in poetry, we are going to talk about Neruda. He wrote a lot about food, and as he should. So this is the third and final poem. Neruda was a Nobel Prize winning Chilean poet. He believed that poetry should be as essential and accessible as bread itself. Neruda wrote hundreds of odes to ordinary things like socks, tomatoes, a lemon, salt, the onion. I think that he was in the podcast that I did with Poetry Pairs with Soup. I'm sure that I wrote. He writes about food. He wanted to celebrate the objects of daily life and the things that we overlook. So his Ode to Bread is a love letter and a political manifesto rolled into one, and it celebrates bread as life-giving and demands that bread be available to everyone. And this is classic Neruda. It is sensuous, it is passionate, and it is deeply committed to justice. So, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it actually is quite long. But here are excerpts from Ode to Bread by Pablo Neruda. Bread, you rise from flour, water, and fire. Dense or light, flattened or round, you duplicate the mother's rounded womb and earth's twice yearly swelling. How simple you are, bread, and how profound. O bread, familiar to every mouth, we will not kneel before you. Men do not implore unclear gods or obscure angels. We will make our own bread out of sea and soil. We will plant wheat on our earth and the planets, bread for every mouth, for every person, our daily bread. Then life itself will have the shape of bread, deep and simple, immeasurable and pure. Every living thing will have its share of soil and life, and the bread we eat each morning, everyone's daily bread, will be hallowed and sacred because it will have been won by the longest and costliest of human struggles. He's just lovely. Okay, so there's 3 interesting things about this poem. I would love to tell you what I think they are. Neruda was a communist, and his politics are embedded in this poem. He is not just celebrating bread. He is demanding that bread be available to everyone. Bread for every mouth, for every person. This is a poem about food justice. It is about the unequal distribution of the world's resources. Second, the poem explicitly rejects religion in favor of human agency. And we will not kneel before you, we will make our own bread. Neruda's spirituality is earthbound. He is not waiting for divine intervention. He believes that humans must create justice to themselves. They must grow the wheat and share the bread. And then finally, he connects bread to the female body, the mother's rounded womb, earth's twice yearly swelling. Bread is fertility. Bread is birth. This feminization of bread is beautiful. And it also feels deeply traditional. Bread and womb and earth have been linked in human culture for millennia. So those are very interesting, very nice things. 3 strengths of this poem. First is its passion. Neruda does not hold back. He addresses bread directly. Oh, bread. He explains how simple you are, bread, and how profound. This is a love poem to a loaf. The emotional intensity is contagious, and you finish this poem wanting to make bread yourself. And then a second strength of this poem is the vision. So most poems about bread stay in the kitchen. Neruda's ode stretches to include all of humanity, all the earth, even the planets. He imagines a future where life itself has the shape of bread. This is utopian poetry, poetry that dares to imagine a better world. And then finally, is the accessibility of this poem. Neruda believed that poetry should be for everyone, not just scholars. This poem is written in plain language. It is written with short lines, with clear images. Anyone could understand it. A laborer could understand it. A child could understand it. And that is actually very deliberate because Neruda wanted his poetry to be as democratic as bread itself. I don't know if democratic is the right word since he was communist, but, I will talk to him over tea if you want, at some point in the universe. I don't know. But that's what I think. 3 language and craft elements of this poem. So the first is the short cascading lines create this sense of abundance. Look at how the words tumble down the page. Bread, you rise, from flour, water, and fire. Those each have their own lines. Each element gets its own line. It gets its own moment. The form itself feels like bread rising, expanding, and overflowing. That is very interesting. I was writing a poem once and I was trying long lines, I was trying form. It was just like I did not know what shape this poem was going to be. And all of a sudden I realized that there was an urgency, and I shortened the lines, and shortening the lines creates this urgency of language. You are only listening to that one line. That one line is the only thing that you have. Every single line is a world into itself. And so this is a use of the craft elements of creating an urgency. Bread gets its own line. You rise gets its own line. From flour gets its own line. Water gets... So that is a way to, if you are working on a poem and you're just like, there's an urgency that I can't get, shorten the lines. Look at what each line is doing. If it's doing too much, just cut it. Cut it and make it a new line. Just, It's okay. It's going to be okay. All right, so the second interesting language and craft elements is Neruda uses apostrophe. Okay, so directly addressing bread as you, this rhetorical device transforms an inanimate object into a beloved. The poem becomes a conversation. It becomes a relationship. And you're not just reading about bread, you are in the presence of bread. The bread is something that you love. That's what's comforting. And then finally is the elemental imagery of flour, water, fire, earth, sea, soil. All of these things ground the poem into the physical world while simultaneously elevating it. And these are not fancy images. These are not unusual images. These are words that everyone can recognize. They are the building blocks of existence. And Neruda shows us that profundity lives in simplicity. And as the poem itself says, deep and simple, immeasurable and pure. These are the three poems, three very different approaches to the same humble subject, three different approaches to bread. Levine gave us a very tender portrait of labor and love. It was a grandfather whose hands were both loving as he shaped the loaf after loaf through night after night, bringing home bread that leavened the very air. Atwood refused to let us look away from where bread comes from, the earth, the dead, the whole cycle of decay and renewal. Together, she wrote, we eat this earth. And then finally, Neruda gave us a vision of bread as birthright, simple and profound, something that should belong to everyone, went through the longest and costliest of human struggles. So what do these poems have in common? They all understand that bread is never just bread. It is a memory, it is mortality, it is justice, and it is love expressed through the work of hands. And they all end in sharing. Levine's grandfather counts his family blessed around the table. Atwood says that bread must be broken so that it may be shared. Neruda imagines bread for every mouth, for every person. And that is why poets keep returning to bread, because poetry, like bread, is meant to be shared. It nourishes us, it connects us, and it reminds us that we belong to each other. Okay, poetry friends, if you have enjoyed diving into this world of verse with us, join us next time. We've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. So until then, keep reading, keep writing, make some bread, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining POETICS Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one loaf at a time.